Somewhere along a lonely stretch of dirt in modern-day Idaho, a rancher's plow still occasionally turns up something that shouldn't be there. A rusted wagon bolt. A shard of blue and white china. A button. And every so often, bone. Not one bone. A cluster of them, unmarked, unnamed, buried just deep enough that the wagons of the 1850s could roll over the grave and keep moving. Because that's the secret nobody tells you about the Oregon Trail. It isn't just a road. Historians who have walked its length and studied its diaries have come to a chilling conclusion: for over 2,000 miles, there is, on average, a grave every 80 yards. Not a monument. Not a headstone. A body. One after another, from the banks of the Missouri River all the way to the green valleys of Oregon. Some of those people we know by name. Thousands more we do not. And a handful of them didn't die at all, at least not in any way anyone could later explain. They simply vanished. A family that waved goodbye to friends back in Illinois and was never heard from again. A husband who walked off from camp to fetch water and didn't come back. A wagon train that rode into a river crossing and rode out short several souls, with no story, no witness, and no grave to mark where they went. This is the story of what really happened on the trail west, and why, more than 150 years later, some of it still doesn't add up. Between 1840 and 1869, somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 people set out from jumping-off towns like Independence and St. Joseph, Missouri, aiming for Oregon, California, and the Salt Lake Valley. They came in canvas-topped wagons pulled by oxen, walking beside them more often than riding, because a loaded wagon was for supplies, not for comfort. They carried flour, bacon, and hope in roughly equal measure. And by the most careful modern estimates, something like 1 in 10 of them never finished the trip. Do the math on 400,000 travelers and you land somewhere between 20 and 30,000 dead scattered across a single road. It is, quite literally, the longest graveyard in the United States. And the astonishing part isn't the number. It's the silence around it. Wagon trains could not stop to mourn properly. There was no time for a coffin, no time for a deep grave, no priest waiting at the next bend to say the right words. If your father, your sister, or your infant son died on a Tuesday morning, you buried them by Tuesday afternoon, packed the earth down hard, and then, and this part still unsettles people today, the wagons behind you drove directly over the fresh grave. Not out of cruelty. Out of necessity. A flattened, disguised grave was less likely to be dug up by wolves, or worse, by the human scavengers who were known to follow wagon trains looking for buried valuables. So the trail itself became a kind of camouflage, one continuous unmarked cemetery, and to this day the overwhelming majority of the dead along it have no name attached to their bones at all. What was actually killing them? Ask most people today and they picture arrows, or maybe a river crossing gone wrong. The truth is stranger, and in its own way more frightening, because the deadliest killer on the Oregon Trail wasn't dramatic at all. It was water. Contaminated water, to be exact, carrying a bacterium that would come to be known as cholera. And cholera on the trail did not behave like an ordinary illness. Survivors described watching a man eat a hearty breakfast, complain of stomach cramps by mid-morning, and be dead and in the ground before sundown. Some accounts describe people appearing perfectly healthy after breakfast and being buried before nightfall of that same day. There was no cure. There was no real treatment beyond opium, whiskey, and prayer. And because the disease traveled through shared water sources at overcrowded river crossings and camping grounds, it could tear through an entire wagon company like a fire through dry grass. Some trains, in the worst years, lost 2/3 of their members before they were even a third of the way to Oregon. Imagine setting out with 30 friends and family members and arriving at Fort Laramie with 10. That was not a worst-case nightmare. For some parties, that was simply what happened. But disease, as devastating as it was, at least left a body. A name in a diary. A widow who knew what had become of her husband, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud for years afterward. The truly strange disappearances were the ones that left nothing behind at all. Take the case recorded in the summer of 1853, when an emigrant, by most accounts, had been drinking, misjudged the depth of a swollen creek known as Buffalo Creek, and drove his wagon directly into the rain-swollen water. He was never seen again. No body was recovered. No wreckage was found downstream. One moment he existed, driving his team into the current with the rest of his company, and the next moment, according to the survivors who kept diaries of the trip, he simply did not. River crossings like that one happened constantly along the trail, and they were, without question, one of the trail's great and underappreciated killers. Ferrymen at the more dangerous crossings knew exactly how valuable their services were and charged accordingly, sometimes as much as $16 for a single crossing, nearly the price of an ox, and one ferry alone is recorded as having earned $65,000 in a single summer moving desperate travelers over 100 yards of water. Those who couldn't or wouldn't pay attempted the crossing themselves, on makeshift rafts or through fords that looked shallow and calm right up until the moment they weren't. Bridges collapsed. Rafts capsized. Wagons rolled. And more than a few times, the river simply kept what it took, offering no explanation and no remains. Firearms killed almost as efficiently, and just as suddenly. Every wagon train carried guns, both for hunting buffalo and antelope on the plains and out of a very real, if often exaggerated, fear of attack. But a loaded rifle bouncing in a wagon bed, or handled by an exhausted, distracted traveler at the end of a 16-hour day of walking, was its own kind of hazard. Accidental discharges were common enough that they rank among the leading causes of death and injury recorded in trail diaries, right behind disease itself. A man cleaning his weapon by firelight. A child playing near a loaded rifle propped against a wagon wheel. A hunting trip that ended not with meat for the table but with a body carried back to camp. These deaths, unlike the river disappearances, usually left a story behind. But they added yet another layer to a journey that was already one of the most statistically dangerous undertakings an ordinary American family could choose to make in the 19th century. And then there is the matter of what people did to each other. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the romantic paintings of covered wagons rolling into a golden sunset, but historians studying court records, diaries, and county histories have documented something close to 200 murders among emigrants on the Oregon and California trails during the mid-1800s. These weren't strangers attacking strangers. Overwhelmingly, they were husbands, brothers, business partners, and fellow travelers, men who had spent months confined together in brutal heat, biting dust, and mounting exhaustion, with tempers fraying until they finally snapped. One of the only such killings with a confirmed grave location involved a Missouri pioneer named Ephraim Brown, murdered near South Pass, Wyoming, in 1857, in what appears to have been a bitter dispute within his own traveling party. Most others were never so clearly resolved. A body would be found. A story would be told to the rest of the company. And the wagon train would move on, because it had to, leaving behind a grave and a version of events that only the people who were actually there would ever fully know the truth of. Disease, of course, didn't limit itself to cholera alone. Scurvy crept up on emigrants who had gone weeks without fresh fruit or vegetables, weakening them from the inside until a minor injury or a hard day's walk could become fatal. Poisoned water was another quiet danger, not from contamination this time, but from naturally occurring alkaline deposits in certain stretches of the plains, water that looked perfectly clear and drinkable and could nonetheless leave a person violently ill within hours. And then there was childbirth, which happened astonishingly often on the trail, since so many emigrant women were of childbearing age and the journey itself lasted 4 to 6 months. With no doctor for hundreds of miles in either direction, and a jolting wagon serving as the only available bed, death during labor was common, for both mothers and infants, and it rarely made it into the tidy version of trail history taught in schools. Add to all of this the stampeding livestock that could crush a child in seconds, the sudden plains lightning storms that could kill a person standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and the gunpowder explosions that occasionally tore through supply wagons, and a picture starts to emerge of a journey where death could arrive from almost any direction, at almost any hour, often leaving behind nothing more than a single line in someone else's diary. Even the objects left behind along the trail have their own eerie history. Fort Laramie, a crucial resupply post in what is now Wyoming, earned the grim nickname, Camp Sacrifice, among emigrants, because so many families arriving there, having wildly overestimated how much they could actually haul across 2,000 miles of prairie and mountain, were forced to abandon their most treasured possessions just to lighten their wagons and keep their remaining oxen alive. Trunks, bookcases, iron safes, cherished furniture carried all the way from homes in Ohio or Illinois, only to be dumped in growing piles outside the fort because there was no one left to trade with and no room left to carry them onward. Imagine walking past mountains of other families' heirlooms, knowing that somewhere back east, someone had once thought that piece of furniture important enough to bring 3/4 of the way across a continent, and now it would simply rot in the open air of the high plains. But if you want the single most devastating chapter in the entire history of the Oregon Trail, the one modern historians still argue over, the one that involves genuine, unresolved disappearances of children who were never fully accounted for, you have to go to the late summer of 1860, and to a wagon train that started its journey in the farmlands of southern Wisconsin. The Van Ornum family set out in May of that year, bound, like so many others, for the Willamette Valley of Oregon. In June, near Omaha, Nebraska, they joined forces with another company led by a man named Elijah Utter. Together, the combined train numbered 18 men, 5 women, 21 children, 12 wagons, and roughly 100 head of livestock, a small traveling village of families who had thrown in their lot together for the protection and companionship a larger group could offer. For most of the journey, that decision paid off. The train crossed the plains without any major catastrophe and reached the largely abandoned Fort Hall, in present-day Idaho, on August 21. There, several discharged soldiers, along with at least one army deserter, joined the party as it pushed onward 3 days later. And for a short while, they even had a military escort, a company of 22 Army dragoons assigned to guard wagon trains through the notoriously dangerous Snake River country. That escort, for reasons still debated by historians, some accounts suggest the commanding officer had grown frustrated with members of the train, peeled away after only 6 days, leaving the Utter Van Ornum party alone in some of the most exposed country on the entire route. About 10 days after the soldiers rode off, on the 9th or possibly the 13th of September, the wagon train was attacked. Approximately 100 warriors, most likely a mixed group of Shoshone and Bannock fighters, and by some accounts possibly accompanied by a few armed white men, descended on the train near a fork of the trail in what is now Idaho. It's worth pausing here to say something that often gets lost in the retelling of stories like this one: attacks of this scale were genuinely rare on the Oregon Trail. Historians who have combed the surviving diaries estimate that only a little over 360 emigrants were killed by Native Americans across the entire 2-decade span between 1840 and 1860, a tiny fraction of the overall death toll, and far outweighed by the number of Native people killed by emigrants over the same period. Cooperation, trade, and mutual aid were the norm along most of the trail, not conflict. But in this one catastrophic case, the norm collapsed entirely. 11 emigrants were killed in the initial assault. The survivors fled down the trail in a desperate scramble, some of them peeling off toward a camp on the Owyhee River, others continuing on, still under sporadic attack, as the days ground on and their situation grew more and more desperate. What happened next is almost too grim to narrate plainly. Cut off from any supply line, with their food gone and no way to hunt safely, the survivors camped on the Owyhee River descended into pure starvation. When an army relief expedition, led by an officer named Frederick Dent, finally reached them weeks later, on the 24th of October, they found 10 survivors alive, and in such a state of starvation that they were, by multiple accounts, eating the disinterred remains of their own party members who had already died. It stands as one of the only documented instances on the entire Oregon Trail where survivors were driven to cannibalism simply to stay alive long enough to be rescued. Among the 10 who lived were the entire Myers family, and 2 women, Elizabeth Chase and her daughter Mary, along with a woman named Emmeline Trimble. Not far from the starvation camp, the rescuers also recovered the body of a man named Christopher Trimble, who appeared to have left the group and gone with a group of native raiders some 2 weeks earlier, and was believed to have been killed shortly afterward. And then there was the fate of the Van Ornum family itself, the story that, even more than a century and a half later, still leaves historians uneasy, because so much of it was never fully resolved. When part of the fractured party reached a location called Farewell Bend the following month, they were ambushed again. This time, the parents, Alexis and Abigail Van Ornum, were killed along with their son Mark, a young traveler named Samuel Gleason, and 2 surviving Utter boys. Soldiers later discovered their mutilated remains inside an old volcanic crater a few miles from the site. But 4 of the Van Ornum children were not among the dead. 3 girls, Eliza, Minerva, and Lucinda, along with their younger brother Reuben, had been taken captive, alive, by their attackers. What followed reads less like American frontier history and more like a mystery that was never allowed a clean ending. Lucinda, the youngest of the girls, died not long after finally being rescued by settlers in northern Utah. Eliza and Minerva either succumbed to starvation or were killed sometime during their captivity in 1861, their exact fate still disputed by the historians who have tried to reconstruct what happened to them. And Reuben, only about 8 years old at the time he was taken, essentially vanished into an entirely different life. He would not resurface until November of 1862, more than 2 years later, when California Army volunteers located a boy matching his description living among a Shoshone band in Utah's Cache Valley. The Shoshone themselves disputed that this child was even Reuben at all, insisting instead that he was the son of a Shoshone woman, sister to the influential chief Washakie, and a French fur trapper. Despite that disagreement, which historians have never definitively resolved, the boy was handed over to Reuben's uncle, Zacchaeus Van Ornum, and brought to live in Oregon among people who considered him family. But whatever had happened to him during those 2 lost years had changed him in ways his relatives could not undo. He never adjusted to the world he had supposedly been born into. By 1870, still only a teenager, he left the Van Ornum family entirely and returned to live out the rest of his life among the Shoshone. To this day, no one can say with total certainty who that boy actually was, what he endured during his captivity, or why, given the choice, he chose to walk back into the very world his family had been torn apart in. No other wagon train on the entire Oregon Trail suffered greater losses than the Utter Van Ornum party of 1860, and no other case leaves quite so many open questions hanging over its survivors. Not every strange story from the trail involves violence at all. Some of the most unsettling accounts are quieter, and far harder to verify, which is exactly what makes them linger. Decades after the main era of westward migration, settlers along the old trail route in Nebraska described stumbling across a cluster of unmarked, unidentified skeletons, evidently the remains of an entire emigrant family, men, women, and children together, with no headstone, no diary entry, and no surviving account of who they were or how they died. According to one settler's own retelling, passed down within his family and later published as local folklore, he and his neighbors spent an entire day carefully gathering the bones, doing their best to reassemble each skeleton with its own skull and its own limbs, before digging a single grave and laying all 12 of the unknown dead to rest together. That same account describes something else, something that cannot be verified the way a death record can, but which the family who told the story swore was true. That same evening, sitting on their doorstep as twilight settled over the plains, they heard what they described as an eerie, mournful cry, like a woman or a child in profound anguish, rising up from somewhere out on the empty prairie. Was it the wind moving through the grass in a particularly unlucky way? Was it a coyote, whose calls can sound uncannily human in the right conditions? Or was it something else entirely, some residue of tragedy left behind by 12 people who died so anonymously that not even their names survived them? Nobody can say for certain, and that, honestly, is the whole point. The Oregon Trail did not just bury its dead. In cases like this one, it buried their stories along with them, leaving later generations to fill in the silence however they could. Strange stories cling to the trail even in places you wouldn't expect. In 1856, a physician named Dr. John Evans was surveying territory in what would soon become the state of Oregon when he reportedly stumbled across an enormous, unusual rock, so large that estimates put its total weight near 10,000 kilograms. He broke off a single sample and left the rest of the massive stone behind, marking its location only in his own private notes. When he brought that fragment back east, geologists identified it as an extraordinarily rare type of meteorite. Before Evans could ever return to recover the rest of his discovery and cash in on what should have been a career-defining find, the Civil War broke out, and Evans himself died of pneumonia, taking the precise location of his find to the grave with him. Decades later, a piece of metal matching Evans's sample surfaced in the hands of a miner, but before investigators could question him further about where he'd found it, that miner disappeared as well, and the true resting place of the rest of that meteorite has never been recovered to this day. It's a strange, almost unbelievable footnote hanging off the edge of Oregon Trail history, a reminder that the region's frontier era generated mysteries that had nothing to do with wagon trains at all, and everything to do with how much genuinely could get lost, permanently, in that vast, unmapped landscape. Taken all together, these stories paint a picture of the Oregon Trail that is very different from the one most of us grew up with. It wasn't simply an adventure. It wasn't simply a hardship to be endured with grit and determination, though there was certainly plenty of both. It was, for 1 in every 10 people who set out on it, a road with no ending at all, a road that swallowed people whole, sometimes through disease that offered no warning, sometimes through water that gave no explanation, sometimes through violence that erased entire families in a single afternoon, and sometimes in ways that no diary, no survivor, and no historian has ever been able to fully explain. 20 to 30,000 people. 10 to 20 graves per mile, most of them empty of any name. A handful of disappearances so complete that not even a grave marks where the story ended. The Oregon Trail promised a new life at the far end of a 2,000-mile road. For thousands of families, what it delivered instead was silence, one unmarked resting place at a time, stretching from the banks of the Missouri all the way to the valleys of the Willamette. If a piece of your own family's history vanished into an unmarked grave somewhere along a trail like this one, with no headstone and no record left behind, would you want to know the full truth of what happened to them, even if that truth turned out to be far darker than the story your family had always told?